So good afternoon and welcome to the key feature of Mindfest today. And congratulations on being here at one of the best mental health raising event on earth at this moment. So let's give a hand of applause to yourself being at the right place at the right time. So we have a wonderful keynote presentation prepared for you. And just so that you're aware, we also will be broadcasting live, streaming across the internet to our colleagues, including the Ryerson University and York University. So we'll be saying hi to those folks out there. They will also benefit from this keynote, even though they cannot be with us. So to officially start to kick things off, I would like to invite a man of brilliance to come up to give some remarks first. He's the chair of the Department of Psychiatry, and not only does he have one of the most brilliant brains, but he has a wonderful mind and a gentle soul. And he can tell you all about his mind and soul as well as the brain. Let's welcome Dr. Benoit Milson.
The normal response to this kind of introduction is I wish my mother would be in the room because she believes I'm a little psychiatrist in Toronto. So, good morning. You have heard my name, Benoit Milson. I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at U of T, and that's why I've been invited to give those brief comments and to introduce our keynote speaker. So, first, I am very pleased to see all of you standing and sitting in the room and attending our 5th annual Mindfest event. And as one of the largest departments of psychiatry in the world, with close to 1,000 faculty members and more than 350 trainees, plus our medical students, we take very seriously social responsibility. And Mindfest was created by some people who are in the room to help destigmatize mental illness, promote awareness, and encourage dialogue. And the problem of no mic is I think that people on the broadcast will, okay, now it's back. And the resonance, maybe those mic on the table should be turned off. So I would like to thank our partners and the planning committee, especially Dr. Lisa Anderman, Dr. Ken Fung sitting there, Alison Musial and Chris Meledes for working hard to organize this event. We're also very grateful to our sponsor, Andrew Pakula, who was here this morning. I'm not sure he's with us this afternoon. And Manulife and TD Insurance, who have supported this event financially. And finally, everyone here today is part of something that's much larger than just Mindfest. You're all helping to erase the stigma attached to mental illness and opening up conversation around mental health. And I'm now pleased to do my job, which is really to introduce our keynote speaker, Jean-Paul Bédard, French name if there is one. Jean-Paul is an author, endurance athlete, and an international advocate for survivors of sexual violence. His best-selling book, Running Into Yourself, explored the power of running to heal trauma, disappointment, and loss. He was named one of the 50 most influential Canadians by Huffington Post, and most recently, the most inspiring Canadian by CTV News in honor of the Canada 150 celebrations. He's also a feature contributor to the Huffington Post and the author behind the popular blog Breathe Through This with over 5 million subscribers. He's known internationally for his humanitarian work and as a leading spokesperson for mental health awareness. Jean-Paul said that life is not about what happened to us, it's about what we do with what happened to us. And we're excited to have him here today to speak on cultivating resiliency. Please join me welcoming Jean-Paul Bédard.
Once again, I always sound way better on paper than I do in person. So I hope I don't let you all down. But I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff today. And my past isn't very pretty, but my present is a lot prettier than the past was. If anything I say happens to trigger anybody, or if there's anything you need to talk about afterwards, please come up and talk to me or find someone else. You're in the right place for that support today. Also, I'll be giving out my email later on and ways to contact me. So please do not leave here with something that's too heavy to hold, okay? You're probably wondering why the heck I'm here. I'm an elite athlete, so why am I talking about mental illness? I don't have a PhD. I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a therapist, a social worker. But what I do have is a massively thick file at CAMH. 27 years. It's huge. If you look in that file, what you're going to see is lots of diagnoses. I'm a survivor of childhood trauma. I am the survivor of sexual abuse and rape. I'm a recovering alcoholic and drug addict. I've been diagnosed with bipolar depression, manic depression, anxiety disorder. That sounds pretty, doesn't it? Well, currently, I'm still under the care of a psychiatrist for complex PTSD. But what that file doesn't talk to you about, and it's the stuff that I want to talk to you about today, is the fact that I think I am fluent in the language of the border of getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. As an endurance athlete, I live in that rarefied air of success and complete annihilation. And I would probably say that my entire life has been found in that same space. My motto, something, I've been selling T-shirts for the charity I work with and promoting it, and it's crazy how popular these T-shirts have become. My motto in life is embrace the suck. And that's very much how I think living with mental illness many days is not about being empowered, but it's about basically learning to embrace the suck, learning to sit with the uncomfortable. So what does compromised mental health look like? Well, I think there are four cornerstones to it. First of all, it's pervasive. It bleeds, it leaches into every part of your life, into every thought, into every relationship, into every fiber of your being. It's isolating. And you know why it's isolating? It's because it's got a lot of stigma around it. We don't like having these conversations with our friends, with our family, and particularly with the broader community. So that's why conferences like Mindfest are so critical, because they allow us to bring this uncomfortable into the mainstream when we realize many of us are going through similar life stories. It's incapacitating. It drains you of your physical, mental, and what I would think to be the most devastating part, your spiritual resilience. And finally, it's self-defeating, because it continually whispers to you, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. No one understands. So now we're going to do a little deep dive into my life. I grew up in a very, very violent home. My mother was suffering from severe mental illness. And for as long as I can remember, my mother was very violent towards me. She hit me. She burned me. She threw things at me. She left marks on me. And from the age of 2, right up until she left, she was giving me extra strength codeine cough medicine 3 times a day in order to regulate my mood and make me easier to deal with. She finally left when I was 9 years old and I was raised by my dad. But because I was so scared as a kid, there was one thing I used to do. And to this day, it's something that I continue to use as a theme in my life. I would be the most scared when I was going to bed at night. And as the darkness started to envelop the room, I would lie in my bed and I would get my hands and I would push them firmly into my eyes. And I would hold them there for as long as I could stand. And as a kid, it felt like forever. And then when I took my hands away, in front of my eyes, those beautiful little white dots started to float in front of me. And I thought they were stars. And I felt really safe in those stars. And to this day, I have colorful stars tattooed up my arm and down my back, because they remind me that no matter what I'm going through, no matter what situation I'm in, I always have a conscious choice, and I'll repeat that, a conscious choice to take myself to a place of safety, to a place of control, and to a place of faith and love. As a kid, I excelled in sports, and because my home was a violent place to be in, I really wanted to be out of home as often as I could. I was the captain of my hockey team. I was a rising track star in Toronto. I played everything except basketball because I'm a little bit vertically challenged, as you can probably see, as I need a podium lift here. And sports was a place of safety for me. But when I was 9 years old, I was sexually abused by my hockey coach. And to this day, I'll never forget the coarseness of his hands, that acrid smell of his sweat, but most of all, the words when I finally broke free, when he said, no one will ever believe you. And that wasn't the end of it. A few years later, I was 12 years old. As I said, I was being raised by my dad, a single father. This was in the late 60s and early 70s in Toronto. And I had stolen cigarettes from my dad. And after school, I had gone into a ravine to smoke these cigarettes that I had stolen from my dad. And it was right around this time, it was early fall. It had been raining, but the rain had broken, but the ravine was still wet and muddy. So I was in this ravine, and all of a sudden, two men approached me. Before I knew it, I was being held down on the ground by one of the men, while the other one violently raped me. As I lay on the ground, the one who was holding me urinated on me. I was left in that ravine. I don't know how long I stayed in there, but I do remember going home to an empty house, entering the back door. And I can remember throwing my clothes in the washing machine. And I can remember sitting in a bathtub, trying to get that mud, that dirt, that sex, that shame off my body. And I'm not going to lie to you. Here I am, more than 40 years later, and there's a part of me that I think will never be completely clean. And that's this part of the mental illness that I struggle with today. Well, things quickly escalated out of control after that. From the age of 14, I became a daily drinker. And then the drugs started up. I no longer played sports. I was kicked out of my high school for selling drugs. I started getting arrested. I was incarcerated, waiting for trials. Things weren't pretty. And it continued that way for quite some time. But here's the thing. Something that addicts don't realize is that behind the addiction lies pain. And I knew what my pain was, but I wasn't talking about what my pain was openly to anybody. And the thing that an addict likes to do is we like to numb or forget that pain. But as Dr. Gabor Mate says, there's no such thing as selective numbing. So as much as I tried to bury that pain with drugs and alcohol, yes, for a time it was working. I was burying that pain with drugs and alcohol. But because there's no such thing as selective numbing, I was burying every feeling. All of the love and support that was still around me, I couldn't access because I was completely numb. I was gone. My drinking and drugging continued to escalate. And because of that, my mental health quickly deteriorated. And that's when I first came into contact with the Center for Addiction Research, which I now think is collapsed into CAMH, and the Clark Institute. And I'll fast forward to my last day of drinking. just so you get an idea of what it looked like, because I don't think you need to go through the horror of an alcoholic drug story. My last few months of drinking, I was on 3 antidepressants a day. I was on lithium to control my moods. I was on lots of lorazepam to deal with my panic attacks. And on top of that, a lot of scotch and a lot of other drugs that weren't being prescribed by my psychiatrist and my doctor. My last day drinking looked like this. I was out at a friend's going away party. And we were there till, around 10 o'clock at night, and one of the women who was there with us, a friend of mine, offered to give me a drive home, but I said, you know what, I'm going to stay because alcoholics don't leave the bar early. So I stayed. She left. Later that night, I finally got home. The phone rang around 5 in the morning, answered the call. It was another friend who was at that bar with me. This lady who had offered me a drive home 5 minutes after leaving the bar, and she had been drinking. Her car smashed into the back of a propane taxi cab. The taxi cab exploded. Because it was summer, a huge plume of fire came through her air vents and gave her 3rd degree burns over her entire body. The heat was so intense, it melted her pantyhose to her legs. A few hours later, we were at that hospital emergency waiting to see if our friend was going to survive the day. When I eventually got in to see her, I looked down at her in that burn unit with tubes coming out of every part of her, covered in bandages. And I looked down at her and I said, that could be me. I was married, I had a young son. That was my wake-up call. So I started to deal with my addiction. I entered a treatment program. And when I was in this treatment program, I met these 2 other guys who were training for a marathon. And they said, hey, why don't you come out and run with us? So I started to do that. And here's an amazing thing about being a recovering addict. We are probably the most pig-headed, determined people on the planet. Give us a positive thing to work towards in life, we're going to move towards that. And so over the course of 4 or 5 months, I would meet these 2 gentlemen every Sunday morning, and we'd go for these long runs, and we would complain and moan the entire time. Not about how hard running was, but how hard it was staying clean and sober. Nobody understood us. Funny thing is, over the course of those 4 months, something happened. People say the opposite of addiction is sobriety. No. The opposite of addiction is connection. We started to connect with one another. We started to build those bridges of trust that we had lost in so many other relationships. We set a goal, and we stuck to it. And the amazing thing was, 4 months later, when all of us lined up for that Toronto Waterfront Marathon, all 3 of us qualified for the Boston Marathon in our first marathon. That's unheard of. But give an addict a positive outlet, things get better. And so it would be great if I could say, wow, that's my story, things were so cool, everything fell into place after that. That would be a short talk, and sadly, that's not what happened. I continue to run. And one of the themes you're going to get throughout this talk is that, JP is a recovering addict, but the addiction has morphed into running. So before anybody asks me later on, JP, do you think you've just replaced one addiction for another addiction? Yes, absolutely, I own that. So we don't have to go there later. But I would suggest in the spectrum of addictions, it may be a healthier one, although my wife would probably disagree with that at times. And that's going to come up later as well. So for the next 17 years, I ran, and I started doing really well. I started, instead of just running 1 marathon a year, I'd run 2 marathons, and then I started running 5 marathons, and then 10 marathons a year, and I started to do really well and get on podiums and win my age group, and things were going really, really great. But then, something happened. I was watching the Battle of the Blades. That was that old CBC program where they would combine ex-NHL players with figure skaters, and they would compete kind of like Survivor. One person got dropped off every week. So I'm watching this with my wife, and the ex-NHL player, Theo Fleury, is up there. And it's the first night of the competition, and everybody's talking about the different charities they're competing for. So Theo Fleury starts talking about the fact that he's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and that he's raising money for this organization out in Alberta. Well, I'm watching this with my wife, and the tears are streaming down my eyes. And Marianne looks over at me on the couch and says, "Hey, what's going on?" "I don't know. I'm just so emotional. I don't know. It's just, I can't look at how brave he is," and all that stuff. A few weeks later, I sat Marianne down. We had been married at that point for 26 years. We had a 22-year-old son. And I said to Marianne, "I'm going to pick up a drink or a drug." She says, "Why? You've been sober for like 16 years. What's the problem?" "I got to tell you about a secret. I can't hold it anymore." And so for the first time, I told somebody what had happened with the hockey coach and what had happened in that ravine when I was raped. And so what does the person who loves you unconditionally do? What does that person do who's been with you forever and through everything? What does that person do? I can tell you what Marianne didn't do. When I told her, she didn't doubt me. She didn't question me. She didn't ask for any more details. But what she did do was she held me. And she believed me, and she said, "I don't know how to fix this, but I know we can figure it out together, and we can get some help." So I went to my doctor the next day, and Marianne came with me. And I registered for a treatment program in Toronto. And it's at a place called the Gatehouse. Now, the Gatehouse works with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And when I walked into the Gatehouse for my intake meeting, before I got the courage to go up the 5 stairs into the front door of that place, I sat in my car in the parking lot for half an hour, and I knew I had a choice. I had a conscious decision to walk up those stairs and open my life to stuff that I'd never wanted to talk about before, or I would kill myself. Those were my 2 choices. And I remember sitting in that car and feeling that wave of decision, what am I going to do? Luckily, I walked up those stairs, and I talked to somebody. And I told my story in detail for the first time, because I didn't tell my wife the detail. And I registered for a program, and it wasn't to begin for 6 or 7 weeks' time, and they said, "You know, we can do one-on-one counseling with you prior to that if you need it." And I said, no, I'm all good. I'll be back in 7 weeks. I'm all good. So I got in my car, and I drove home, and I did what I always did. I didn't talk about it. I bottled it all up. And I did what I always do. I ran. I ran a lot. And in the 7 weeks before the program started, I had a commitment to make. I was committed to go down to run the Boston Marathon for my sponsors. And Marianne, you know, as fate would have it, had bought a plane ticket to come down with me before this whole disclosure, before all that stuff. So she came down to Boston. We flew down to Boston, and I thought, oh, thank God. 3 days out of Toronto, I'll get away from my family, I'll get away from this sexual abuse thing, I'm just going to get away. So I ran the marathon. It's always on the Monday, Patriots Day. And it was a hard marathon for me. At one point, the race officials pulled me off the course because I was crying from hyperventilating so much. So much trauma was coming up with every footfall as I was running. I managed to get back on the course, and I finished the marathon, and it was a slow marathon. And then I found Marianne at the family area at the end, and I fell into her arms, and she looked at me, and she said, "It's going to be okay." So we have 3 hours before our flight back to Toronto later that day. Luckily, I'm in a hotel right at the finish line. So Marianne says, "I'll check out, you have a shower, I'll meet you down in the lobby in 20 minutes. I hop upstairs, grab a quick shower, Marianne checks out, puts the bags in the stowage area, I come downstairs. 5 minutes later, we're back out on the street. Within a few minutes of being back out on the street, boom, the bombs went off. I don't need to get into what this was like. You've all seen this news footage. You know what that probably felt like. And this is the birth of my complex PTSD. I was dealing with the trauma of the sexual abuse that I'd finally started to talk about, And then a few weeks after that disclosure, I'm now in a terrorist attack. We managed to run back to the hotel. I haven't slept in 24 hours. I've just run a marathon. I haven't eaten anything in over 10 hours. And I'm terrified. We got back to Toronto around midnight that night because they had locked down the airport and they had blocked everybody's cell phones in Boston because they weren't sure if there was more terrorist attacks coming. And the next day when the FBI asked if anybody had any video of the footage from the finish line, Marianne said, "Hey, I took a video of you on your iPhone when you were crossing the finish line." We pull it up and we see, as I'm crossing the finish line, just directly across the street from where Marianne was standing, is the bomb on the sidewalk. And we realized how close we were to this being a much more horrific story in our lives. I went into work the next day. I opened my mouth. I was a teacher. Nothing came out. I ran to the principal's office, grabbed my stuff, went to my doctor, and I went on a medical leave for 5 months to deal with the PTSD, to go into the gatehouse to deal with the sexual trauma. And when I was in that gatehouse program, something told me I needed to go back to Boston. I had to face this fear. I had to go back and confront the thing that scared me most. So I decided to go back to Boston the following year, and I wanted to raise some money for this treatment program who had helped me. So the plan was to run the Boston Marathon not once, but twice in the same day. And I would raise some money for the gatehouse. So I got to Boston, and at 5 a.m., I lined up at the finish line, and I ran from the finish out to the start line, 42.2 kilometers. I had half an hour, and then I turned around, and I ran the marathon with the rest of the athletes. So for a total of 84.4 kilometers. And it was a crazy thing to do. I know it's a crazy thing to do, but I'm an addict. This is what we do, right? And managed to raise over $25,000 just on Twitter for this treatment program. Because I was an athlete and I had a profile and I was talking about the fact that I'm a survivor of sexual violence. I was talking about the fact that I am a recovering addict. I was talking about the fact that I struggle with mental health issues. The media went crazy. I did almost 100 interviews leading up to that double Boston and in the week after it. And I realized I had a platform. I had a responsibility to help eliminate some of the stigma around these issues. Came back to Toronto, and the race director of the Toronto Waterfront Marathon is a friend of mine. His name is Alan Brooks. And he said, "Hey, JP, can you do something like that here in Toronto?" Yeah, I can do so. I'm an addict. Of course I'm going to do something, right? And I've done it twice, so why the hell not do it 3 times? See, a lot of your students, so you're good learners, and you're starting to see a pattern in here. So I started just before midnight, and I ran the marathon course once. And then at 4 a.m., I ran it the second time. And then I lined up and I ran it with the rest of the athletes for 126.6 kilometers. And I managed to convince Premier Wynne that if I'm going to do this, you've got to run the first 5 kilometers of my 3rd marathon, the official marathon, with me. And we did it for the It's Never Okay campaign. That was a campaign that came out just after the whole Jian Ghomeshi story broke about sexual awareness and the importance of standing up for other people and being present for other people. Well, story doesn't end there, folks. Last year, I know, it's good, it's crazy. This is crazy shit, I'm telling you. So last year, I ran it 4 times. So yeah, I think I went out at 2:30 in the afternoon, ran it once, and then I ran it the second time at 8 p.m., and then the second time at just after midnight, and then lined up with everybody to run it the 4th time. So that's 168.8 kilometers. To give you an idea of that, that's equivalent to getting in your car. Boy, I wish I could have got in a car. Getting in your car in downtown Toronto and driving all the way to downtown Buffalo. It's a long way. in just under 19 hours that took. So it was a big success in terms of media awareness and raising money. In 2 weeks' time, the Toronto Waterfront Marathon happens again. Now, I crossed this finish line, and I did a media interview within 30 seconds of crossing that finish line. And that's my wife, Marianne, beside me. She's the hero of this story, and you're going to find that out shortly. So I crossed the finish line of that thing, and I was gone, man. I was dead. Some of you might want to know the numbers. I burned over 16,000 calories during that time. I know. I ate for free for like a week and a half after that. Don't try that at home, right? It's one of those things. So as soon as I crossed that finish line, I was interviewed, and the interviewer was saying, you know, this is amazing that you've just done this, JP. What are your plans for next year? And so jokingly, I had been saying with friends, you know, Drake calls Toronto the Six, right? Oh, you're young, you know this. A lot of crowds like, what? Why do they call it the Six? I don't have to explain that. We're all in our hometown. So Drake calls it the Six, and I said, well, I really like the hashtag 6 in the 6. So it's 416, so that's why it's called the Six. So I thought, 6 marathons in the 6. That sounds kind of cool. As soon as I said that, I look over, and Marianne has that I'm going to kill you look. And I'm like, babe, I'm just kidding. Of course I'm not going to do this. Took a few months. And I managed to convince her. Got a logo created. Once you get a logo created, there's momentum. So in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be running this Toronto Waterfront Marathon 6 times. 253.2 kilometers. That's crazy. And I'm already thinking, I've got to find a city that has a postal code or an area code ending in an 8. 8 and 8. No, I'm not going that way. So I do a lot of speaking, and when I do speaking, you know, I get off the stage, and people come up and say, JP, you know, there's usually a lineup of people, JP, you're so strong, you're so resilient, and they say all these things, and I look really uncomfortable. I look like a deer in the headlights, right? I'm like, oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And then I go back home or back to my hotel room, and I cry. Right? And those, like, that sirens of the fraud police start going around in my head. If people only knew how messed up my head feels, how I don't feel strong. And so I decided that I wanted to write a book about resilience. And it's a selfish book. I'm an addict. I'm selfish, right? So it's a selfish book. I thought I would interview really strong, resilient people from around the planet and ask them what makes them resilient and try to figure out if I have this happening inside of me, and what's making this happen. So over the last year and a half, I've interviewed over 150 people from around the world, 350 hours of interviews. Now, I've interviewed some big-name people. I've interviewed many Olympic gold medalists, Nobel Peace Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, Academy Award winners, politicians, lots of famous people, and then lots of people like you and me, who have stories of resilience. Now, the people who I've spoken to, we've covered a broad spectrum of issues. So I've talked to people with all types of trauma, the sexual violence, the domestic violence, the addictions, the food issues. I've talked to LGBTQ issues. I've talked to Indigenous and First Nation stories. I've talked to former child soldiers. I've talked to people who have lost their entire families to genocide. I've talked to parents who have lost children tragically to suicide and to violence. I spoke to one of the parents who lost her daughter in the Sandy Hook school shooting. I talked to people who are dealing with severe physical and mental obstacles in their lives, caregivers of these people, people at the end of their lives. It was a wholehearted conversation with people about what resilience looks like and what it feels like. And I can't give you all the details because my publisher will not be happy about that until that thing comes out. But basically, I'm going to share with you 4 qualities of resilience that have come up. The first is the importance of community the importance of being seen. And this is critical when we talk about mental health awareness. Statistics. So I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I've spoken to you about that now. I'm comfortable talking about that. Let's look around the room. I'm going to share a statistic with you. In Canada alone, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. Next time you're on a streetcar or a bus, in your lecture hall, look around. Think about all of those people. Think about how that cascades into trauma throughout your entire life. I always thought my life pattern was somewhat unique and troubled. I'm sad to report it is a common trajectory of people who experience childhood trauma. Here's another thing that I know. When we are in community, when we are talking and we are building resilience, we are challenging silence. Silence kills. The next quality that came up is what I call the importance of surrendering to the fall. It's an importance of embracing a mindset of overcoming. Yes, I will face struggles, but yes, I will always find a way to keep moving forward. For 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, I will keep moving forward. This is what resilience looks like. There's a researcher in the States who I love, and his name is Martin Seligman. He comes up with something called the 3 Ps of trauma. And the 3 Ps represent personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence. So next time you are struggling or you are around someone who may be struggling with a mental health issue or a trauma issue, consider whether it's being personalized, whether it's pervasive, and whether it's permanent. I'll give you an example of my own life. Personalized. I am the fault for the rape that occurred when I was a child. I shouldn't have stolen those cigarettes from my father. I shouldn't have been in that ravine. I should have gone home after school. It's my fault. Pervasive. This part of my life is terrible, therefore every part of my life is falling apart. Everything is horrible. There's no goodness. When you're a practicing drug addict and alcoholic, that's a real hard one to get rid of. Permanence. Nothing will ever change. Because I feel this way now, I will always feel this way. So as a supporter, as an ally, as an advocate of somebody out there, I want you to ask yourself, is this person struggling with one of these 3 Ps? The next thing is what I refer to as the fault lines within us. We've heard a lot about earthquakes lately. Now, when we have earthquakes that happen on our globe, we focus on the devastation of it, the human loss, the loss to property, to livelihood, devastation to families and communities. But if we take that lens back a little bit further and we look at earthquakes the way that plate tectonics looks at earthquakes, we realize that any ecosystem, any system that is not able to crack, to bend, to be fluid, and to open up and change is an ecosystem or environment that is destined to fail and die. I'm here to tell you that resilience means finding those openings within us, those fault lines within us, and embracing them. And finally, the most important quality that came up in these interviews was empathy. Seeing yourself in others. I know as a recovering addict, when I walk into one of my 12-step meetings, and 20 years clean and sober, I'm still going to 3 of those meetings a week. I walk into those meetings and people are speaking my language. They're from the same planet that I'm from. People who suffer from mental illness often are attracted to others who suffer similar traumas, similar paths, because we speak the same language. And it's when we speak that same language that we feel empathy for others, and hopefully we start to feel it for ourselves. I'm going to close with what I think is the most important message today. I'm going to take a drink, too, because I get a little worked up over this one. This is a picture of my wife, Marianne. This was taken when I did the Toronto Marathon 3 times, so 2 years ago. Marianne is waiting for me in the dark on Bay Street, right near City Hall. She's waiting for me to come around the first marathon before I start my second marathon. This is a woman who has been with me through addiction. This is a woman who has seen me suicidal. This is a woman who has seen me stand up in front of the public and say, I was raped as a child. This is a woman who has believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I challenge each and every one of you today. Look around you. Find that person who needs your help. Be a parachute. Be a lifeboat. Be that person so that if you need that person, you've created the bridge of connection. You've helped break some of that stigma that this conference is all about. And finally, my contact information. And this is something that is really near to me and dear to me. Many of you are educators. Many of you are connected to community agencies. Many of you are struggling yourselves, or you have children who are struggling, or friends who are struggling. I'm making a pledge to you today. You contact me, I will go anywhere you need me to go. I will speak to whoever you need me to speak to. And the reason I'm willing to do that is not because I'm special, it's not because I'm a hero, it's not because of any of that stuff, it's because of the slide you saw before that. It's that person who was a lifeboat and a parachute in my life. You're stronger than you think you are. Together, we are way stronger than we think you are. I wish you all the best. Thanks for having me.
So I think that we all can see why he's named one of the most influential and inspiring Canadians. And we want to really thank you for generously sharing your story and your bravery. And I think that we can see how you can redefine what we mean by addict. I think this is one of the main message of hope, courage, and recovery. So let's open the floor for some discussion and questions.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So if you have a question, just simply raise your hand up and I will come to you with a mic.
What's the name of your book that's coming up?
Is that on? Oh, hang on, I think we have to share. The second book that I'm working on right now is called The Geography of Resilience. Yeah. The first one is Running Into Yourself.
Okay. Maybe say your name and where you're from.
Sure. My name's Melissa, and I'm from Toronto.
Hi, Melissa.
I was just wondering how it was that you got into speaking, your first speech, what that was like.
How did I get into speaking? Well, I think I'm an addict. And I think every addict that I've ever met, we like to describe ourselves as megalomaniacs with an inferiority complex. So that's pretty much me. You give me a platform, I'm happy. I am so comfortable talking to like a big group like this, or over 1,000 people. I'm great like that. Stick me in a small room with 3 or 4 people, I am so uncomfortable. So that's probably why I went into teaching. I'm a retired teacher. I taught for 24 years, and I don't know. I just feel like I'm at a point in my life now where there aren't a lot of men talking about childhood trauma. There are not a lot of men talking about, Brené Brown vulnerability. There's not a lot of guys doing that stuff. And if you look through my past, you will see that probably 95% of the relationships I've ever had in my life, the closest relationships, are with women, and I think my story probably explains why I have an easier time relating to women. And so I'm hoping by speaking and being in front of crowds and maybe getting other men to come forward, because it's hard telling my story over and over again, but I'm at the point where I feel that I can't not do it, because on a typical week, I will receive upwards of 150 to 200 emails from survivors or parents of survivors from around the world saying, what do I do? What do I do? And like, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a PhD, I can't fix you. But what I can do is I can listen and I can say, I believe you, you're not alone, I speak the same language, and there's hope. So when I speak to, like I do a lot of speaking in front of schools, and it's age appropriate speaking when I talk. But there are parents often in these gatherings, and I think parents look at me with two minds. I'm either the horrible ghost of Christmas future for their child who is coming through trauma, right? And they hear the horror story of what happened to me as a teenager and adult with the addictions and all that stuff. And that just must be horrendous. But in the same token, I think they look at me and they think, wow, this guy is coming out the other end. And I'm here to tell you, I have not come out the other end. I don't think there's an end. I am coming through this. I am working through it. I still see my PTSD therapist. I'm still in a support group for that. I still go to recovery meetings 3 times a week, and I run 200 to 250 kilometers a week all year long. That's not normal. But I think it's better than it used to be.
Hi, my name's Kieran. I'm one of the psychiatry residents, so training to become a psychiatrist. And I'm wondering, in your experience in engaging with mental health treatment, when you look at the practitioners that were the most helpful or you felt most comfortable with, are there traits of theirs that kind of stand out or things we should avoid doing? Like, what would you want to tell us? We're training and we want to be helpful.
I can't believe I get to answer that question. Okay. Oh my God. I have a friend in the audience who's a licensed therapist, psychologist who knows how exactly I'm going to answer this question. 2 things. Now, with my PTSD brain, I have to remember the second thing. The first thing being, until I disclosed publicly that I'm a survivor of sexual violence just over 4 years ago, I had spent 46 years in treatment facilities, in countless doctor's office, in psychiatry departments, psychologists, therapists, all those letters at the end of people's names. I met you all. Not once did any of these individuals say to me, is there a history of sexual abuse in your past? And I think it's because what happens when you open that box as a physician? There are very limited resources to support that person. People feel uncomfortable. And I would even suggest that many of the helping professions feel uncomfortable talking about it. So as you are going out into the field, you're going to start working with people like me, don't be afraid to investigate that avenue. As we know, the statistics, 1 in 3, 1 in 5. I'm sitting in my 12-step meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to out myself. It's not a problem. I'm in a room of 100 other alcoholics. Statistically, I know 95% of these people are survivors of childhood trauma. So it's not a big mystery what happens if we don't treat it. The second thing is, I was working with my psychiatrist at CAMH who specializes in PTSD, and her name is Dr. Carolina Vidal. She is a sweetheart. I am forever indebted to this individual. I was working with her. And she directed me to another counselor after she left. And this individual works at Women's College Hospital in their trauma department. And I was seeing her every week talking about PTSD and working through things. And every week we'd get into her office and for a 1-hour appointment, and she would shut the door. And I'm like a trapped rat when you shut that door, right? I'm like, oh my God, I can't think of anything to say. I just need to get out of here. And I wasn't able to open up. And then she, about 6 weeks into this, 1 year appointments every week. 6 weeks in, she says to me, I sense you're uncomfortable. Why don't we start something or try something next week? I'll meet you in the lobby of Women's College Hospital when you come. I'll have my coat on. And we'll walk around Queen's Park for the hour, and you can just talk to me. You got to sign this massive release form before we try this. But we'll try it. And so that's what we did for the next 8 months. We walked downtown Toronto, and I opened my heart to her like I've never opened up before. And so maybe think outside of the textbook is probably my advice. That was a great question, by the way. When you asked me why did I want to speak or what makes me want to speak, boy, it's being the person who gets to answer that. That was great. Thank you.
Any other questions from the back?
Thank you so much for sharing your story. My question is there anything in particular you say to yourself in the morning to propel yourself to move on?
Is there anything I say to myself in the morning to propel myself to move on? Well, that's kind of a funny question, too, because anybody who knows me or follows me on social media would know that I'm an early morning runner. So 365 days a year, I wake up just after 4 a.m. Yeah, just after 4 a.m., and I quickly get dressed to go out on my run, and I run from upwards of 2 to 6 hours at a time. And that's not bad now, but let me tell you, in the middle of January, at 4 a.m., that bed feels pretty damn good. So what compels me to keep moving is, number one, I've tried to take the obstacles away from my life that would stop me from moving forward. So the simplicity of my running is a metaphor for this. I put my clothes out the night before. I check the forecast the night before. I set that alarm same time every morning. I don't think, oh, maybe 5 minutes snooze, 10 minutes snooze. I just get up, and I don't think about it, and I go. So this is what I've started to do in terms of moving forward and every day. I've had to do, especially coming forward as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And I am a public figure. When I said I was sexually abused as a child, it was the front of the Toronto Star and a lot of the other papers. When I came forward, I lost. My father has passed away. But since coming forward 4.5 years ago, I haven't spoken to my mom, and my 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters haven't spoken to me. There's a family connection to the abuse. Now, that's a common, sad, common story of many people who disclosed childhood trauma. I've done something called social editing. I've found those relationships that feel good in my life, and I've tried to nourish those and to delete a lot of the ones that don't make me feel good. As an athlete, I'm super in touch with my body and nutrition. So I love junk food. But if I only eat junk food, I don't do very well. So I think there are relationships in my life, and I would venture in most people's lives, that are very much like junk food. You can kind of hang out with it for a little while, but then, if you stick around for it too long, you start to feel a little crappy the next morning, a little hungover. I had so many relationships in my life that felt like junk food, and not enough that felt nourishing. So I'm trying to surround myself. I created this thing, this organization, this team with a few close friends called JP's Team. And it's a group of athletes from right across the world, and not only athletes, but supporters who have decided to get together and talk about issues that are uncomfortable, childhood trauma, finding those edges and those boundaries within us and pushing forward. So right now, this thing called JP's Team now has almost 1,500 members from around the world. And it doesn't cost anything, but what it is just a way of creating a community. because what I learned when I did that research for that book on resilience is the number one thing I need to do to make sure I'm still alive tomorrow is to be connected. And so that's my new family.
Okay, maybe one last question, if there was one. Okay.
My name is Gigia. I'm from Brazil. And I would just wish to thank you because I'm inspired by your story. And this is really beautiful. And ask you, don't stop sharing your story with people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot, really does. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. It was really touching. I was wondering, you did mention you were on a couple of medication, and with your activity level, I'm just wondering if it ever influenced, like you feeling drowsy or not being able to follow through with the level of activity that you were doing, and if so, what did you do, or what kind of motivated you to continue?
Okay, so that's a big medical history question. Right now, and this is the part that kind of, to me, sounds good, but anybody who hears this answer starts to step back and look a little weird at me. So I'm currently not under any medication. I have been off antidepressants, off lithium, off lorazepam, off everything for almost 15 years now. There's no denying that running is the endorphin boost for me that gives me the serotonin that I need. So part of my resilience right now is trying to imagine a world where I'm not able to have that massive serotonin endorphin hit every day from running, because I'm almost 52 years old, and if I keep doing like 6 marathons on, that's just not a good way to nurture that. So I have to figure out of what that will look like. And I'm hoping it's the community part that will help that. You're welcome.
Yeah, community. Also, you talk about many ingredients of healing, right? So Mindfest is about looking at all different aspects of healing, certainly includes psychotherapy that you mentioned, support groups, all of it, right? And in conjunction with being looked after by healthcare professionals.
Yeah. I have a massive medical care team behind me,
yes.
Like huge, like it's huge. Yeah. And the funny thing was, my psychiatrist at CAMH at one point said, we have to keep JP healthy because he's really important in terms of the community of mental health in Canada. And so it's kind of cool because now I'm like their racehorse. They want to make sure that, okay, yeah, JP needs to come in for an extra appointment. Okay, we'll make that happen, no problem. I'll take him on. So it's good that. So, I say every chance I get that the people who have gone into helping professions, the people who are there walking towards the stuff and the conversations that most people are scared of, all of you individuals who take home that vicarious trauma with you every day and then manage to come back in and sit in a room or walk around Queen's Park with people like me, I don't think I'll ever have the words and the love to say how much that is important in my life. So thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for keeping my lights on in this little head, because it's kept my marriage alive. It's allowed me to build a relationship with my son, who's now 28 years old, who now looks up at me like I'm a good dad. He's inspired by me. I've broken that family trauma that went over and over in generations in my family, and I've given him hope just by being brave enough to say, I have some broken bits in me, and I'm okay with those broken bits. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
So I think on behalf of the organizing committee, on behalf of all of us here, John Paul would like to thank you for excellent talk, very inspirational, very, very genuine, and really sharing parts of yourself. And I hope that you know that behind this big team you have, now you have even a bigger team because we have everyone here really being connected with you and supporting you in any way we can. So thank you very much, Jean-Paul.